Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm so excited to be with you today for what is sure to be an impactful learning experience with Bob Tiede and Dr. Michael Marquardt as we celebrate the release of their latest book, Leading with Questions. This is the third edition of the book, the subtitle, How Leaders Discover Powerful Answers by Knowing How and What to Ask. And we are so thrilled that many of you are already coming in. We had over 700 people registered for today's event, so we expect a lot of interaction. And we want to get that started right away. So if you can take a moment and let us know in the chat where you are calling in from today, we would love to see that. And in the event that you are calling in today as part of your professional development and you are representing your organization, go ahead and tell us in the chat what organization you're representing, and I will do my best to shout out some of you. It looks like Bob's next door neighbor has joined today's event, so that's pretty cool. And I am noticing that we are an international event. We have Orlando, Chicago, we have London, the UK, Rhode Island, Georgia, Colorado, Orange, California, Waltham, Mass, Pennsylvania, Nashville, South Dakota, Louisiana. These are coming in faster than I can read them. I do see that we have someone in Cape Town, South Africa. We have some Canadian callers, a truly international audience today. So thank you to all of you who are joining. We have someone in Ghana, someone in India. So very excited to be learning with you. As we get started today, I do want to let you know about a few housekeeping items. You may notice that we are recording today's event. After the event, you will be able to access this recording forever on Weaving Influences YouTube channel, and we would welcome you sharing it with colleagues, rewatching it, and helping others to find out about this content. So the way today's event is structured, we will be having some conversation at the beginning with Bob and Michael, and later on, we will open up for some questions from you, which you can put into the chat at any time. So, if you have questions while we're having our conversation, please put those into the chat. We will get to as many of them as we can at about the 35-minute mark. We hope you'll stay for the entire event because quite often those questions that come in from you are the richest. Okay, so before we go any further, I do want to take a moment to introduce today's presenters. We do have Dr. Michael Marquardt, who's a professor emeritus of organizational leadership and learning at George Washington University. He's also a co-founder and was the first president for the World Institute of Action Learning. He has written over 27 books and 100 professional articles on human resource development, leadership, team building, and organizational change. 27 books.
Yes, a lot of work.
That is amazing. Now I'm also thrilled to introduce my friend Bob Tiede, and if you've been on webinars with me before, you might already know Bob. Bob is so famous at Weaving Influence. He's been a client of ours for over a decade, and we've loved working with him. He's on the U.S. Leadership Development Team at Cru, an interdenominational Christian parachurch organization. And just last week, Bob celebrated 11 years at his blog, Leading with Questions. And I think later you might find out how the blog got its name. Bob is followed by leaders in over 190 countries because he has translated his free resources into multiple languages to reach leaders around the world. Bob has multiple free ebooks available on his website, including Great Leaders Ask Questions, 339 Questions Jesus Asked, Now That's a Great Question, Little Book of Big Leading with Questions quotes, and 262 questions Paul, the Apostle of Christ, asked. And those have been downloaded by thousands of leaders around the world. And it's amazing, Bob, the impact that you've been making with your work. So before we get any further, though, we do want to engage all of you in a poll because we are so curious about your previous exposure to the work in this book, Leading with Questions. So have you previously read the first or second edition of Leading with Questions? And if you can let us know that on the poll, you should see that on your screen. Have you read both? Have you read only the first edition? Have you read only the second edition? I'm noticing that we don't have an option for none. So I think if you have not read either of the first two editions of this book, you can put that in the chat. And we may be able to tell by the people who answer the question or don't, who has had exposure to this book in the past. I see lots of nuns in the chat, lots and lots of nuns. And I'm going to close the poll in just a moment and share those results. Okay, it looks like of the people who have answered the poll, about a quarter of you have read both the first and second editions of Leading with Questions. And about half of you have only read the first edition. 20% have read the second edition. So thank you for that. It looks like we also have another poll for you today. And we're curious to hear, how important are questions in your leadership? And if you have any comments about that, we would love to see that in the chat as well. Bob, Michael, any thoughts on how important our audience may feel that questions are based on their attendance at today's event?
Well, I'm guessing that most of the folks will be saying important or very important because they are attending, and I already realize that questions are valuable for their leadership.
I think that you are pretty on point today. It looks like what we have is that more than 80% of you feel that questions are very important in your leadership, and 16% of you say they are important. So there are 2% of you that say somewhat important, and potentially by the end of today's event, you may have a slightly different view. So thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts on those two polls. And we do look forward to being engaged with all of you throughout today's event. All right, so Michael, as we get started today, I would love for you to talk to us a little bit about the concept behind the book as released in the first and second edition. What was it that inspired you? Amongst all the other books that you've written, 27 of them, you have done 3 editions of this one book. So talk to us about why you wrote them.
Well, I give you a little bit of background. I had worked in global leadership for about 25 years in 40 countries around the world. And about 25 years ago, I became a professor of global leadership at George Washington University. And obviously an interest in research for me was to find out what makes great global leaders. And so that was the prime interest I had. And I interviewed leaders from all over the world and went into the top organizations. And I asked people in the organization, who are the best leaders in your particular corporation? I particularly went to organizations that were very successful. And they would identify an individual or a couple individuals. And when I went to those individuals, I said, you've been identified as one of the top leaders in this organization. Why do you think you were identified? And they said, well, I like to ask questions. They probably like the questions I ask. I find questions very valuable for me. And it became quite consistent that the great leaders in these organizations around the world were those people who asked great questions. And then I did some look at the literature, and whether it's religious leaders or political leaders, government leaders, they also were people who asked questions. So that gave me the germ of the idea for the book. And so I said, okay, I'm going to write a book about great leaders, but it will be focused on the questions they ask. And so I asked these leaders, when do you ask questions? Why do you ask questions? Who do you ask questions of? What types of questions do you ask? And so that formed the basis of this book in terms of getting as many leaders as I could to share their best ideas, the best questions they asked.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I bet along the way you found some questions that you started to incorporate in your own leadership.
Well, of course, I think when you search for great question, you find one that really well, that's a wonderful question. But I think one thing I noticed is that it wasn't so much the specific question, because each question is unique to a particular situation. But there are certain kinds of questions that I thought were the strongest and were frequently mentioned by these leaders. And these were questions that empowered people, helped them feel more comfortable in asking questions, or gave them courage or confidence to go forward, or questions that helped them to learn. What have we learned from this experience? How can we do it better? So it was kind of the learning questions and the empowering questions that caused me to start using those questions more frequently.
Well, I bet we'll talk a little bit more about those as we go throughout today's session. Now, Bob, today we're talking about the 3rd edition. This is the first edition on which your name is listed as a co-author. with Michael. And I know that one of the reasons why you became a part of this third edition is because of the impact of the first two on your journey. So Bob, can you tell us the story of how the first edition of this book changed your leadership forever?
Be delighted. In 2006, my wife Sherry loves to go to bookstores. In 2006, we were in Orlando. We went to a Borders bookstore. And our practice is she goes all over the store, but she knows when she's done, I'll still be in the leadership section. And I generally pull off 2-3 books I've never seen before, peruse them to see if one's going home. Well, in 2006 at that store, and literally this is the book, this isn't just the same book, it is the book that I bought in 2006. It was a page turner for me. I guess it has a lot of glare, but it was a page turner. And I took it home, I devoured it. I was already on the US Leadership Development Team for Crew. I began to teach out of it. I put eight session seminars together. And then fast forward, in 2012, one of my crew colleagues had started a blog. And she said, Bob, you ought to start a blog. I won't share that whole story, but I said, okay. And when you go to WordPress to start a blog, the first thing required is, what do you want your blog to be called? i.e., what do you want as the URL? And on a lark, I typed in leading with questions, smiling as I did, thinking surely, and I didn't know Mike at that time, but surely the author or the publisher will have tied up the title of the book. But I found it was available and at entry price, $29 a year or something. No one was holding it hostage. And so I took it. But in the back of my mind, I felt just a little awkward, like I didn't know Dr. Marquardt. So how would he feel when he discovered there was a blog out there with the title of his book? So I waited 3-4 months, got content out. And then I wrote very carefully an email. I found his email address, sharing how his book had changed my leadership forever and how I'd started this blog, and asked if I might have permission to excerpt from the book, have the picture of the book, a link to Amazon for purchase. And I sent that off with a little fear and trembling, not knowing how he would respond. Well, within 24 hours, I received the most gracious response from Mike, giving me carte blanche effort to repost any excerpt I wanted, and started our friendship. Well, a few years later, Mike came up with the second edition. And prior to the second edition, I get an email from Mike saying, Bob, would you be willing to write an endorsement? And second, could I list leadingwithquestions.com as a recommended resource? It was like, yes. And then shortly after the book was released, we were taking one of our leadership groups to DC, checked in with Mike, found he was going to be in town, asked if he'd be willing to come and speak to our group. I said, I will buy books for everyone. And could you come an hour early to sign them? And that was a selfish request. I knew I would then get to spend an hour with Mike opening books so he could sign them. And that's when our friendship, I'd say, really began. And he's just been such a great friend, such encourager. And then a year and a half ago, I get a call from Mike saying, Bob, it's time for a third edition. Each edition needs about 20-30% new content. Bob, would you be willing to co-author? It's like, what? Yes. And I consider that just such a privilege. We spent a lot of time last summer putting together the third edition.
Well, so can you tell us about what's new in the third edition for those, at the beginning of the hour who said they've read the first and the second editions? The third edition has a bunch of new stuff, so that this isn't part of the script, but I'm curious. So will you tell us?
Well, we continue over the past 10 years to keep interviewing, talking to great leaders. They keep emerging in different industries and different parts of the world. So in this edition, we have a total of 45 leaders we interviewed. The second edition had 30, the first one had 15, so every edition. So you can imagine the fourth edition may have up to 60, although we always have to limit the number of pages that the publisher wants. So we have a lot more stories, examples from 15 additional leaders. The environment has changed. We do a lot more of our work virtually, teamwork, problem solving, whatever it may be. So some of those issues that emerged in the environment, some ideas, strategies on how different people use questions to get a greater impact. Bob, you may have some other things that you've seen in the new edition as well.
Well, what was fun is I kept bringing things to Mike, and he really was the editor because he knew the previous books, and I'm sure one of the hardest decisions was what to delete, because all the content had been good. But what puts a smile on my face is when I see stuff that actually I'd written in the third edition.
I bet that is a thrill. So let's talk a little bit about this concept of leading with questions and how leaders can improve their effectiveness by asking questions. So why is asking questions of your staff so much more effective than simply telling people what to do?
I can respond. Yeah, I'll go first. Becky, do you like to be told what to do? Or would you rather be asked, Becky, what do you think we might do? You know, that's a question that begs an answer, but it's so true. None of us like to be told what to do. And so that means your staff don't like to be told what to do. But when you ask, hey, what do you think? In fact, Becky, let me ask you the question this way. Whenever you've had a supervisor, someone you reported to, say, Becky, hey, what do you think we might do here? How did that make you feel?
Yeah, well, it's been a while. But certainly valued, included, respected.
Yeah. So Becky, you are the leader, the CEO. How will your staff feel then when you ask them, hey, what do you think we might do?
Yeah, well, you know, we have Kira on the chat who's helping out today, so I would love to see from her, but I'm imagining that the same way I would feel is the way that my team members would feel when I ask a question instead of giving direction.
Yeah. Mike may have another response, but that's kind of my quick response why asking questions is more effective.
And also, when you ask questions, not only does the other person feel respected, they like you. We have relatives we may or may not like, but we love people who ask us questions that give us an opportunity to shine, to demonstrate our worth. And that's a universal phenomenon. Every culture, every person enjoys being given the opportunity of helping someone else who has asked for help. And so questions not only make you more creative and help you get a different systems approach to a situation, but it creates an inner warmth in yourself. And we like to work with people who respect us and think we have something valuable to offer to them or to the group.
Yeah, it seems to me like we have to make sure that we're sincere in wanting an answer to our question and really being open to the response, because I can imagine there are times when leaders might use questions as a weapon or somehow as a trap, which is absolutely not the right way to use a question, right?
Yeah, I think, you know, to be an effective questioner, it involves a certain characteristic of the leader. The leader has to have respect, and we use Carl Rogers' term, unconditional positive regard for the other person, that they believe that the other person has some worth, the other person can grow, can change. The great questioners are humble people. They're curious, they're eager to learn. And so the great questions are ones in which you are curious about an idea or a situation or a possible opportunity. You don't already have the answer. You think this person may have some background or interest that can be of value. And so the mindset of the questioner is very important, respectful towards the other person, but also humble, respectful of him or herself, and recognizing the power that he or she has. Because a question immediately makes you a leader, particularly if it's a great question. And you have to use that power in a valuable, helpful way rather than a manipulative way. And usually, I think a person receiving a question can quickly feel or discover or sense that this is a genuine question, curiosity, and me being valued, or is it just a manipulative question?
Becky, I often say there's actually two skills at play here. First skill is asking great questions, but the second skill is then listening to their answers. And that's what I'm thinking Mike is saying here. I mean, if you're not planning to listen, then don't ask the question.
That is a quote to capture for the books there, Bob. So I would love for the two of you to share with us some of your favorite questions that you discovered in researching this book or along the journey so far.
Well, I frequently share, and maybe many who've joined today know this, I'm a farm boy from South Dakota. You have to keep it simple for me. And one of the greatest things I love about leading with questions is that so many of the great questions are so simple. They're not long, complicated kind of things. And whenever I speak, I ask the audience, who here would like to learn to lead with questions in 30 seconds? Well, virtually every hand goes up. And I say, now, the reason I've asked this is many times I get a sense from the audience they'd like to learn to lead with questions, but they imagine they're going to have to get a master's degree in questionology, like a nice idea, but not practical. So when they hear 30 seconds, they're all in. And so I usually pull somebody up and say, all you have to do is memorize my 4 favorite questions. And so I find somebody with a second hand on their watch to be the timer. And I say, here's my 4 favorite questions. Do you have them memorized? Share them with the group, and they always do. So I'll share them quickly. First favorite question is, what do you think? Now you would tie this about some issue, some challenge, some opportunity. And they will answer, but when they pause, instead of just moving on, my second favorite question is, wow, what else? And I find that when we ask the first question, people instinctively roll out a safe answer to see how you're going to treat it. So if I ask Mike, hey, Mike, what do you think about? And he gives me that first answer. And I say, well, Mike, that's stupid. Everyone knows that. He's sorry he answered. And I'm going to get nothing, not only then, but in future. But when I say, wow, Mike, that's good. What else? Mike relaxes and actually gives me more. And I've discovered it's actually the third and fourth question that gets to their gold nugget, their very best thought. And again, I share with leaders that if they've only been a teller, just employing these 4 questions in their next meeting, one-on-one with the staff or with their staff around the conference table, whatever the issue is, saying, gang, what do you think we might do here? And then listen and think, wow, well, what else? Or there's variations of this, hey, say more about that. Hey, this is really good. I'm taking notes. Please continue. But it's on the third and fourth that you get to their gold nugget. And a farm boy from South Dakota can ask those 4 questions.
Not hard to memorize those 4. Michael, what would you add?
Well, oftentimes say we tend to ask negative questions or cause people to be judged and whatever. So I think great questions are one that kind of first look at what are you doing well. And as many of you know in the audience, that I've been very active in action learning over the past 20 years. And we work on problems, but we work on how well we work as a team. But it can be done on an individual level. So whenever I work with a team, at a certain point, we pause and say, what are we doing well? And get that information out from the group. Then what could we do better? I have found that you don't have to say what we're doing poorly. If you ask what can we do better is a much more positive question. It causes creativity and has some benefit. What we are doing poorly has really no benefit to solving the problem or the relationship or whatever it may be. So I use that question. Those 2 questions are always good, whether it's with your spouse or with a neighbor or whatever. How is our relationship? What are we doing well or in this particular problem or this situation? Those are 2, I think, invaluable questions that we can use in almost any situation.
So I see a question in the chat from my friend Paul Thornton, who says, asking questions is great, but is it always the best option? If I have no experience or have no idea how to do a task, I want to be told what to do and how to do it. If I have a lot of experience, I want to be empowered to do the task. So delegating is the best option. So any thoughts for Paul?
I would agree.
Go ahead, Bob.
Mike.
Okay, I was going to say, anytime you make a statement, you have lost potentially the opportunity to lead, to inspire, to create. So statements cause lots of potential damages. It can cause people to resist, to deflect. And many times we think we're better off having someone tell us what we should do. We don't have confidence in ourselves. And great leaders, one of their most important roles is to develop the people around them. And you don't develop them by giving them the answers or telling them what to do. And you're not a very valuable employee if you only do what you've been asked to do. That worked maybe 20 years ago or 50 years ago. But in today's environment, we are all continuously interacting with customers and clients, and we have to make decisions on the spot with the people in front of us. We cannot wait for someone to tell us what to do. And if we become dependent on someone else to guide us and direct us, we'll never be a leader ourselves or really valuable to that organization.
So we have some questions in the chat about Bob's 4 famous questions. And for those of you who are asking, it's basically you ask one question, but then you continue to ask what else, what else, what else. So questions 2, 3, and 4 are what else, what else, what else? Yeah.
Yes.
That's easy for anybody to remember.
And you can use the variations of say more about that. Hey, please continue. This is really good.
Are there any other favorite questions that you want to share with the group before we move on to the next topic?
Well, one in the book that it's been in the previous editions, but I absolutely love. Navy Captain Michael D. Abrashoff, when he took over the command of the USS Benfold, however the Navy measures morale on that ship of some 200-300 vessels in the US Navy was the absolute lowest. Under his command, 18 months later, they retested. Morale was the highest of all ships in the US Navy. And the first thing he did upon taking command is he had 300 interviews, one-on-one with 300 sailors on that ship, only 15 minutes each. And he asked them 3 questions. And again, everyone in the audience today will have these memorized upon hearing them once. The first question is, what do you like best about this ship? Second, what do you like least? Third, what would you change if you could? And at the end of the first day, he might have only met with 10 or 15 sailors. He had a whole bunch more to go, but there was a buzz on the ship. The new captain's different. He actually cares what we think. And it didn't take long, and he heard things and thought to himself, what? What do you mean that's not being done on this ship? Now, he did not promise to make every change that he heard, but it didn't take long. And Becky, when he began to announce changes, guess who he gave credit to for the ideas?
The people who shared the ideas.
Yeah. You might have been a new sailor on that ship, and the captain names you as the person that gave the idea. Well, when you just hear that, you understand how morale on that ship began to increase. And those 3 questions will work in any organization you are a part of.
I love that.
A question I ask in my, I do a lot of leading with question workshop, and I always start the workshop off with the question, what is a great question you have been asked in your lifetime? And what was the impact of that question on your life? And oftentimes great questions oftentimes require reflection. Sometimes don't have an answer immediately. You might have to wait an hour or a day. But I know it's a great question because I get great reflection, and great reflection always leads to great learning and ultimately great actions. But we all have been asked a great question. We forgot about it. But if you ask someone, what's a great question you've been asked? And after they think about it and discover it, they realize how that question perhaps changed their life. It might have been from a parent or a friend or a spiritual leader, whatever. But those were great questions. Sometimes a great question, I use this to show how a small question can mean so much. I have 4 children and 10 grandchildren. And one of them, one time, one of my grandchildren was spending a night with us. And I put her to bed, and like most 2-year-old, 3-year-olds, when you put them in bed, okay, now let's go to sleep and so forth. And then she looks at me and she says, she has a final question. Grandpa, can I hug you?
Oh,
I said, okay, yeah, we get a big hug now, and she goes back to sleep. But that took courage apart because she probably already had gotten a couple hugs and had her story. But she had the courage. Can I hug you? And that changed me. I mean, I remember that granddaughter very fondly. But it took courage on her part, a 2-year-old, to ask an adult, this question. But great questions can come from any place. Another great question I received was an editor for a book series says, "Can you write a book? Will you write a book for us?" And this was 30 years ago. I'd not ever written a book. I didn't think about writing a book, but he said, "You've been very involved in global leadership the past 20 years. Why don't you write a book about it?" And took a while, and it took the courage, but eventually I wrote a book, and eventually 27 books. But that was a great question. If he had never asked that question of me, Bob and I would not be here today.
that's a great question.
Yeah, Becky, can I make another comment?
Sure can.
Here's something else that's true about a great question. We all ask a lot of questions that help us learn something we didn't know. And those, we ask them all the time. Those aren't bad questions. But a great question helps the person being asked to learn something about themselves that they didn't know or might never have put together. So like Mike's question of what is the best question, the greatest question you've ever been asked? Well, most people don't have a ready answer to that, like boom. But as they think about it, it helps them discover something about themselves that they hadn't ever verbalized before.
What's showing up for me as I'm listening, sometimes I like to think about how we can use questions to lead ourselves. And so it occurs to me, how might my life be different if every day I ask myself a question like, what's the most important thing I can focus on today? Or, what's the one thing I want to get done today? I don't know if either of you use questions to lead yourself, but that's what's been showing up for me as you've been sharing your powerful questions.
Well, questions have the unique ability to go deep into the subconscious. When you receive a question, whether it's from other people or yourself, it goes into your consciousness and subconscious and causes a change in behavior. The way to right away to demonstrate that, for example, Becky, you and I could be having a conversation. I asked Becky, can you think of the name of the person we met at that business meeting last week? And you cannot think of the person. And we continue our conversation. And maybe 10 minutes later, say, oh, yes, that was Jim Morris. Well, how do you remember Jim Morris when you were consciously having a conversation with me? Well, what was happening, your subconscious was doing the work and searching because the subconscious wanted to close the synapses that I had opened. And so I encourage people, if you're going into a meeting, before you go into the meeting or before you begin a day, you're going to have a big event, saying, how can I make this a great meeting? Or what would be a great question I could ask this client when I meet with her this afternoon? The power of questions is you do not need the answer, you just need to ask the question. So if you ask yourself the question, your subconscious do the work for you. And when you're having this meeting with your client, all of a sudden you'll come up with a great question never thought of because your subconscious does the work. And so I encourage people, whenever they go into some event or activity or something that's very important, but maybe very complex, very intense, very difficult, just ask the question, how can I make this successful? What might be something I could do that will enable me to be more successful with this person or this group, or to open up the relationship, or to solve this problem? We're working on a big project. What can I do at this group meeting to help our organization come up with the answer to this project? You don't have the answers. Your subconscious do the work, and you just it'll just spill out and say, gee, I never thought of that before. It just occurred at this moment when I'm talking to this person.
So I have a question in the chat from George who says, have you asked a question before you go to sleep and then you let your subconscious wrestle with it overnight?
I've done it. I try not to keep myself awake because sometimes very quick you ask just a great question before you go to sleep. You say, well, gee, here's some possibilities, etc. But I know that's a possible. So I may not have a specific question. I just might say, how can I make this meeting great tomorrow without going into any specific? But sometimes, because a great question is very stimulating, it's very inspiring, very exciting. So I would encourage yourself to ask questions before you go to sleep, that get your mind to work on preparing yourself, creating the atmosphere and the relationship that you want, rather than what is the particular question. Just saying, what are some great questions I can ask tomorrow? Good night.
I love it. So, Bob, you've shared before that leaders who lead with questions are often 10 times more effective than leaders who lead by telling. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that's possible?
Becky, can I ask you a couple of questions?
Well, sure. I guess I'm on the hot seat today, Bob.
Becky, just imagine that you have your entire team and you're in a big rowboat. We'll just say you and 9 others, 10 of you on this rowboat. It's your executive team. And you want to get that rowboat across the lake as quick as possible. Becky, how many of them would you like to have row with you?
Every single one, please, Bob.
Yeah. Again, it's a silly question, but it's a setup question for the next question. Becky, I want you now to imagine they're not in the rowboat, they're around your conference table. Now listen to this question carefully. If you're a leader who thinks your job is to tell them what to do and their job is to do it, how many mental oars are there in the water figuring out the way forward?
Only mine.
Yes, 1. But the moment you turn and use my 4 favorite questions, whatever the issue is, hey gang, what do you think we might do here to address this challenge or take advantage of this opportunity? And then you listen. Now with 9 others plus in the room, plus you, how many ideas might you hear?
Quite a few more than my own.
And it's not a guarantee they'll have better ideas than you, but is there a possibility you might hear some ideas you hadn't thought of that are better than what you'd thought of?
Yes.
And so you're hearing one, and Kira just shared something, and you think, wow, that's better than anything I was thinking. So you say, Kira, would you be willing to lead our team in executing on that? How hard is she going to work?
Probably harder than she would on my idea.
Yeah. And as leaders, at times we have to give people the freedom to climb the mountain the way they want to. Yes, we've given them, here's the peak, here's where we need to get to. But understanding when we get them freedom to climb the mountain on their route, they go with full motivation. And when we go with their ideas, it's like their good name is on the line. At least they're going to feel that way. And so that's just some of the ways, Becky, that I think illustrate we hear more ideas. Involvement breeds commitment. And when we let people go with their ideas, they're committed because they're going with their idea. So it's some of that makes leading with questions so much more effective than a leader who simply is the dictator.
Sure. So I wanted to take a moment to address a question I saw in the chat from Kat, who's asking if the chat's available or will be available. So at the bottom of your Zoom panel at any point, you can download the chat, the public chat. We do not make it available after the call. So if you'd like to get access to all the amazing questions and comments in the chat, you can choose to download that from Zoom yourself, Kat, and others. I'm sorry for the little detour, but I did want to make sure that we could make that available to everyone because there is some gold in the chat. We haven't even gotten to most of it. Michael, do you have anything that you want to add about how questions increase a leader's effectiveness or anything you've seen?
Well, a couple of points building on Bob. One is that when we ask a question, we may have a specific intent, and sometimes we have questions that guide. But often the power of questions that we often get much more than we ask for. That we may be asking for a specific idea, but because of the quality of our questioning skill, we not only get response to our idea, but maybe other ideas or possibilities that were not intended in our question. So that's the power of question. The other thing is be aware that questions accomplish many things simultaneously, particularly if it's a great question. The greater the question is, the greater the impact, the greater ideas that emerge and so forth. But oftentimes we think questions are only used for one or two purposes. That, okay, questions are good for problem solving. But leaders use questions. When I did my research, I found that the leaders had used questions for 7 different purposes, that they got many benefits from questions. First, it helped them solve problems. People were much more creative. We know that all the inventions in history of the world were because of a person asked a question that no one else had asked before. So questions help a group become more creative, or an individual become more creative as they're working on a problem. So we know that questions are great for problem solving because of the creativity involved. But leaders also use questions to build teams. If they have a group of people who work together, whether it's a staff group or working on a project, these leaders realize if I can get people asking questions of each other, I will build a better team. This will be a team that is more creative, it accomplishes its tasks more quickly. They enjoy working together, and they keep getting smarter and better. All of us work in teams, and some of the teams work for us, and we're part of teams, but these people realize that questions built the teams. It created the glue that enabled these teams to work more together. I think a third reason why leaders use questions is that it changes the culture, it changes the relationships. It creates, particularly in an organization, if you're in a questioning culture, you tend to be a culture that's more trusting, more open, more supportive, more creative in a number of different ways. Questions also change relationships. I can go up to any stranger walking on the street in front of me now, and if I go to that person saying, "How are you?" Well, my wife's in the hospital. What happened to her? X and Y and Z. So what are you going to do about it? And the person describes. And I see that person a week later. I say, what happened? And the friendships are built relationships. We, as I mentioned before, we may have relatives that do not ask us questions, but friends are people we ask questions of, and they ask questions of us. And that is the essence of all friendship, is the questions. Another reason leaders use questions, it builds their leadership skills and the leadership skills of people around them. The more questions I ask of people around me and allow them to ask questions of me, I develop my leadership skills, whether it's a leadership skill of listening or inspiring or system thinking or patience. So questions develop the leadership skills. And as we talked earlier, questions also get people to take action. Things they did not think they could do, that was impossible. And the question inspired them, that they made leaps and bounds that enabled them to do things beyond their present capability. So I encourage our audience, the questions do an immense number of things in a powerful, beautiful way. And so when you make statements, you perhaps have lost the opportunity of creating these other benefits of questions.
Bob, do you have anything you want to add there?
Well, one of the things that I'm thinking about is a leader who thinks they need to have all the answers because they're the leader. That's an incredibly heavy burden to carry. And I kind of know because I was once that kind of leader. and ultimately, well, quite often that leader, including me when I was that kind of leader, asked a question you don't know the answer to. But if you feel like the leader needs to have the answer, you make one up on the spot. And my staff were kind. They didn't actually call me on it, but I bet a bunch of them were thinking from time to time, I don't think Bob really knew. I think he just made that up. And when you switch, this is so easy now. When I'm asked a question, I don't know the answer. Becky, that's a great question. I don't know the answer. What do you think might the answer be? Now, a staff member may say, well, Bob, that's why I came to you, and I don't know the answer. Wow. Well, Becky, where could we find the answer? And generally, they'll have a thought or two on where they could find the answer. And then, Becky, would you go find that and bring it back to me? Because that is a great question. Now, with that little response in my brain, I actually can now respond to any question. I'm not afraid of any question, because when I don't know, I simply say, I don't know, but it's a great question. Do you know? Where could we find out? Would you go find out and bring that back to me? And in other words, you make them feel valuable. You validate that they asked and that it's a great question and that the answer would be of benefit.
Now, we all know leaders, may work for leaders who do not ask questions. And one of the reasons they don't ask questions is they don't realize the potential power and benefit of questions. And we've described in our book in great detail about how questions do many marvelous things. But I may now know that questions can be very valuable, very helpful, but I still don't know how to ask questions. Or my psychological experience throughout life has been negative. Whether as a child, my parents told me to stop asking questions, or at school, teachers told me to stop asking questions, or my classmates made fun of my questions. So we have kind of psychological reasons why we don't ask questions, but we've never been trained how to ask questions. We go to school and we get all kinds of training and all kinds of skills and information and history and philosophy and economics, whatever it may be, but we never get trained in how to ask questions. The most important skill of life for every person anywhere in the world, the most important life skill beyond question is the ability to ask questions. And the better your questions are, the more happy your life will be, the more you'll be able to help the world become a better place, the more you get things solved and so forth. So we don't get trained in questions. We don't have people who are mentors or bosses who can model questions. The organization discourages questions. So it's very difficult for us to be a questioning leader or for us to be able to challenge a non-questioning leader, because we don't know how to ask questions, what the question to ask, et cetera. But questions have immense power if we know when and what and how to ask.
Bob, you have something I know.
I see Kate asked, how can you incorporate questions into the meeting agenda? Kate, I love that question. And here's something that I've learned. You know, and when we put together a meeting agenda, you make a list of the topics. I suggest that leaders then go back and turn every one of those items into a question. What is the question you want answered in the meeting? And if you can't come up with a question, maybe it doesn't need to be on the agenda. But when you turn those into questions, like, for example, if on just a list of topics, one of them was national conference, would your staff know what you actually want to decide in the meeting? Well, they could guess, but if the question is, who should we invite to speak at the national conference? And they see that in the agenda, oh, now they're beginning to think. They know exactly what will be discussed in the meeting. And so that's my suggestion. Turn every item on an agenda into the question you want answered in the meeting.
I often encourage people when they read a book, if you're a student, and when you see the textbook, you have headings for different categories. Just change the text heading into a question, and you will learn much more. You don't have to read it 16 times. You might read it once or twice, understand it, because your brain and synapses work. I think the other thing to be aware of, more and more senior people in organizations, CEOs, are recognizing they have to create a culture that encourages leaders to ask questions, because it helps the organization, be more creative, better relationships with customers and clients. I'm doing a keynote speech next week for a large Global 100 corporation, and they have as their theme, question everything. That's the theme of the conference. I'm the keynote speaker. They're bringing their top 130 people for 2 days to begin changing the culture. And it's not question everything in a negative way, but question everything to learn more from it, to work better together, to build trust. I think a sub-theme of the conference and the questions, we need to trust each other more, because that will allow us to question each other more. But it's kind of a chicken and egg. It's hard to build trust without questions, but questions will build the trust. Just as I often say that all great leaders ask great questions, but great questions will make you a great leader. There's always some initiative that you have to take or the organization have to take, but anyone in the organization at any point in time can be the leader in that organization or in that group that's meeting by asking the right question at the right time of the right people.
Well, as you might imagine, we are getting so many amazing questions in the chat. And I saw one earlier that I wanted to come back to from Janet, who was asking, how can I lead in this way with questions if I'm not the responsible leader?
Well, if oftentimes the greatest need for questions is when a group is working on a task or a problem. And the group is working on a task for which they don't already have the answer. Otherwise, they wouldn't be working together as a group. So whoever asks a question at that moment in time is the leader. And the better your question is, not only your leader, but your question will influence the final outcome. There may be 100 steps between your question and what the organization. But I think we all have the opportunity any moment in time of being a leader, of asking that question. But asking a question sometimes takes courage, and it takes confidence, and it takes skills. And so we have to sometimes practice questions for ourselves or colleagues, but it's hard to ask great questions. But if we don't ask questions, I often refer people to the story of the Titanic. 1912, 1,400 people lost their lives because the Titanic went down. And before it was sunk, it was called the Unsinkable. So they had a commission saying, well, to the engineers saying, why do you, what do you think? Was this ship unsinkable? It was marketed as unsinkable. They only had 20% of the lifeboats they needed. The captain did not worry about going through the iceberg. But they asked the engineers who built the ship, did you think that this ship was unsinkable? And they all said unanimously, each one individually, when interviewed, said, no, there's no such thing as an unsinkable ship. Well, why did you express a doubt or at least raise a question when they said it was unsinkable? Well, we are oftentimes uncomfortable or afraid to ask a dumb question. And because of skills, psychological, all the thing, but with those questions not asked, we have great disasters, some of which is, minor losses, but some is the loss of 1,400 lives, because any one of those people, engineers, if they'd ask questions, well, what would happen if this or that? But no one else in the room was able to ask the question. They all had the same fear. If one person had asked, well, what would happen if, the other 12 said, yeah, I was thinking the same thing, but I thought I was the only one.
Yeah, so courage to ask the questions at the right time. So we want to let you know, I can tell that all of you are really benefiting from this conversation due to the quality of the questions and the comments in the chat. So we want to let you know some very special ways that you can continue to engage with the content in the book. So we do have a few special offers for you, and Kira's going to show us a slide in just a moment. I do want to address the questions in the chat about downloading the chat. I understand that we don't have today's session set up to allow you to download the public chat. We don't typically make the chat available, but when I send the follow-up email with the link to the recording, we will share an attachment of the public chat for those of you who have said it's important to you to have all those comments and questions cataloged. So just know I will get that sent out with the follow-up email. You should receive that tomorrow along with a link to the webinar recording. So a few things that we would like to encourage you to do today, and Kira's going to put some links in the chat for you. First of all, buy this book today. And you may want to also buy a copy for every single person on your team. For those of you who have been asking about how do I encourage others to ask more questions, a great way is to pass along the book. If you have already read and gotten benefit from the book, we would encourage you to leave your review on Amazon. Those early Amazon reviews provide important social proof for those who are choosing to explore and possibly buy the book. And we want to get as many of those reviews as fast as possible to expand momentum and awareness for this book. Also, we have an opportunity today for you to become a book ambassador. And when you choose to be a book ambassador, you're making a commitment to share the book with your online communities, to write a review. And when you agree to become a book ambassador, we'll get you a free book because you're choosing to support the book in that way. One last message or offer for you is if you order 20 plus books and there are bulk retailers that have discounted pricing for you, you will get a private Leading with Questions webinar with one of the authors, subject to availability. So we would encourage you to check out the bulk pricing for this book, and that will be in the chat as well if you want to choose today to order 20 plus copies so that you can have a private webinar for your organization. So I see some questions in the chat about where to order the book. It's available at all your favorite online retailers. For those people who are looking to buy the book internationally, that can sometimes be a bit trickier, but we would encourage you to look at your local Amazon, whether that's Amazon UK or Amazon DE or Amazon CA in order to order the book. Yes, Bob.
It's on Kindle.
It's also on Kindle, of course. You can
So it can
get
be
the
gotten that
book
way anywhere in the world.
internationally. All right. So as we come to the end of the hour, I do want to acknowledge that many of you put in amazing questions that we did not get to answer. And Kira, if you want to stop sharing the slide, I want to thank you. You know, the great news is that Bob has a blog on which he shares ongoing content. So I'm going to recommend that many of the questions that were in the chat that we didn't get to could become the ideas and the jumping off point for some upcoming blog posts. You like that idea, Michael?
Oh, yes.
In terms of how to become a book ambassador, I believe there's going to be a link in the chat from Kira where you can sign up to become a book ambassador. Do we have that link? We do have the link.
There it is.
Perfect. There it is. All right. So in just a moment, what we want to do is get some feedback from all of you about this session. And what we want to ask you the question, what was your biggest takeaway from today's event? And it's going to take me just a moment to get it ready. We're using Mentimeter, and I'm going to invite you to answer that question. You should be able to see that in your Zoom and answer on the chat. And then I will be able to share my screen and show you the answers to that question. So if you can just take a moment to share with us. This is always tricky when we try to use new technology. Let me try that one more time. We'll be with you in just a minute, but hopefully you should have the chance to answer this question for us in a moment, which is, what is your greatest takeaway from today's event? And I'll be sharing that on the screen in just a moment. So in the event that this doesn't work, I do want to invite you to try to just put those answers to your greatest takeaway in the chat for everyone to see. It seems like we're experiencing some technical difficulty with the Menti this afternoon. So go ahead and tell us your greatest takeaways in the chat. And then I also want to kick it back to you, Bob, and to you, Michael, for some parting inspiration. Are you ready?
Yep.
Who's
So
going first?
Okay, what was your question again? Make sure I have it.
Oh, we just want to wrap up with some parting inspiration.
Well, I say, as I mentioned earlier, if you ask good questions, you'll be a good leader. You ask great questions, you'll be a great leader. And a leader is not just hierarchical. A leader is the influence, the impact, the benefit you offer people around you. And I guess I always kind of close with some of a blessing or a prayer. May your life be filled with great questions. Because if in fact all 700 people who have viewed or will be viewing this webinar, if your life is filled with great questions, you're going to have a great life. You're going to have impact on other people. You're going to have great relationships and do great things. So may your life be filled with great questions.
The good book says you have not because you ask not. And if you don't ask, the answer is always no. And so anytime you ask a question, you dramatically increase the probability of learning, of benefiting, of hearing things you didn't know, of getting something that you don't have. And so ask.